Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. Welcome to episode 2 of my Ranking Stephen King Decades. Now, in my previous episode, I ranked all the Stephen King books that were published in the 1970s, and I will, of course, link that video down below. I had a fun time filming that. And for this episode, or for the next 2 episodes, I will be ranking all of the books that Stephen King published in the 1980s. And the 1980s were very, very prolific for Stephen King, so much so that I have to split this video into 2 parts. So this first episode of the 1980s will be kind of like my least favorite Stephen King books from the 1980s, and then my next episode, episode 3, will be my favorites from the 1980s. I think I have 10 books in this episode, and then for that episode, it'll be 9, for a total of 19 Stephen King books, which I wonder if he did that on purpose. Probably not, but still, it's a fun anecdote that he wrote 19 books in the 1980s. Anyway, even though this is my first episode of the 1980s, and technically these are my least favorite books that he wrote in the 80s, and there are definitely some bad books in here that are, I'm looking at one in particular. You probably know which one I'm talking about. I really hate that book, but there are a lot of great books in this episode that I'm going to talk about that probably a lot of people are going to be mad that they're very low on my list. But he wrote so many great books in the 1980s that it's really hard to put some of these books in the top echelon, right? So even though that some of these books in here are fairly low on the list, relatively speaking, I still really like them. So don't be too mad at me, because he wrote so many great books in the 1980s. And before I begin, just leave down in the comments below, what is your favorite Stephen King book from the 1980s? I'm sure a lot of people's answer is not going to be my answer, so it'll be very fun to see, the audience reaction from that. But yeah, let's just, enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. Oh, also, I forgot to mention up front that Creepshow, he technically wrote this and published it as a comic book in the 1980s. I've, of course, seen the movie. It's one of my favorite Stephen King movies, but I've never actually read the comic book. I don't own it, so I figured I'd throw that in as an honorable mention. But, yeah. Okay, let's just get this out of the way. So, not only is this book, number 19, my least favorite from the 1980s, it is overall my least favorite Stephen King book that I've managed to finish. And that would, of course, be The Talisman, not only written by Stephen King, but also co-written by Peter Straub. Easily my least favorite Stephen King book. This is the only Stephen King book that I have not given at least 2 stars from. I gave this just piece of utter garbage, 1.5 stars. I couldn't quite put it on the same level as like 50 Shades of Grey, which that's a whole other story of why I had to read that book. But I gave this book 1.5 stars. I did not like this book in the slightest. I didn't like any of the characters. It was a slog to get through. It was so boring. I really didn't like anything about this book. And yeah, it's easily my least favorite from the 1980s, and overall, just my least favorite Stephen King in general. All right, next up for number 18, I won't call this book a bad book. It's just not something I'm terribly interested in. And the way that King writes it, you'll see when I mention it here, but it's Danse Macabre for number 18. And this is actually a nonfiction book. And when I first tried to read it, I was interested just because, oh, it's Stephen King, the master of horror, talking about the horror genre. But you get a little ways into it and you realize it's not typical Stephen King writing. It's very dry, it's very academic, it's very scholarly, and I really didn't care for it, and I thought a lot of it was pretty boring, and a lot of it was about stuff that I had never either haven't read before or stuff that I hadn't heard of, and I just wasn't terribly interested. I'm probably never going to reread this book. Probably not. So yeah, it's definitely one of my least favorite King books overall, and it's my second least favorite from the 1980s. All right, so now we're on to number 17, which, again, not a great Stephen King book. It does have its fans, and funny enough, Stephen King himself says that this is a bad book, so I don't feel at all bad for putting it this low on the list. And that would, of course, be the Tommyknockers, which he wrote in 1987. And this was one of the last books that he wrote under the influence of drugs and alcohol and that sort of thing. And you can tell because this book goes in some weird directions. And like I said, Stephen King himself says that this is a bad book. And he says, like, there's a good 300-page novel in here somewhere. Yeah, out of like a 700-page madness of a book. There's some people who really like this. I don't. I think because this is like a typical problem with Stephen King. He'll write a chunker of a book in 3 parts. Part 1 is usually amazing. Part 1 in this was pretty good. I was fairly interested in what was happening. And then part 2 loses me. It just jumps all over the place. It's so boring and just so, but also chaotic. It's so weird. And it's a chunker, so, I mean, you guys know how I dislike a lot of chunky King books, so is it really that big of a surprise that it's this low on the list? I don't think so. But let me know down in the comments if you actually like this book. I'd be very interested in hearing your opinion on it. But for me, it comes in at number 17, the Tommyknockers. And for number 16 on the list, this is actually a much shorter book compared to the Tommyknockers, and that would be Cycle of the Werewolf, which I don't have the dates with me on these, but I think this was 1983, which makes sense because the movie Silver Bullet was in 1985. And speaking of the movie, this is one of the rare occurrences, not rare, but fairly rare occurrences where I much prefer the movie adaptation to the book. For me, like, it's sort of like a novella, but it's also kind of a graphic novel because you get pictures throughout the book. For me, it's too short, which I just said that the Tommyknockers was too long, but you get the opposite problem with this. There's not enough meat on the bones for me to care about what's happening, and I think this would have been a much better, like, short novel. Like, this could have been a really interesting, like, Richard Bachman novel. Like, if he did it as a Werewolf Bachman novel, that would have been pretty cool. But the way it's written, it's too short. It's written like each like small chapter snippet thing is from like each month, but it's just too short. It's fine, but I actually much prefer the movie. So for me, it's not one that I go back to again and again. But luckily for Cycle of the Werewolf, it's short. So that's basically the only reason why it's higher than the Tommyknockers. But yeah, I've got Cycle of the Werewolf at number 16. For number 15 on the list, this goes to a book that I reread a few months ago with a buddy of mine, Josephina, because we're reading all of the Richard Bachman books this year, and then we've already had our live discussion for this book, and then we'll eventually have a live discussion for the rest of them. But the one that I'm talking about here for number, 19, 18, I can count, number 15 is The Running Man. It's not one of my favorite Richard Bachmans. I think besides Rage, which is easily my least favorite, this might be my second least favorite. Like, I had a much better time the first time I read this because I was just kind of having fun with it. But the second time, it was just such a downer. Like, it wasn't the fun book that I remembered it being, because like you get descriptions of like the horrible living conditions these people have to live in, and then like all the stuff that people have to do to just get money to survive in this horrible environment. And I didn't enjoy reading it. It's still good, and it's written very differently from most King books, because a lot of King books, it's longer with like longer chapters, but this one's extremely short with like 100 chapters. So written very differently than a lot of King books. And for me, it's never really been one of my favorites. So I'm gonna have to go with The Running Man for number 15. And for number 14, this might surprise some people because we've been doing a read-along for Stephen King short stories with the Stephen King Short Story Book Club, and the book that we're reading now is Skeleton Crew. And for me, this one is overrated. I don't quite get why people would love this one more than Night Shift. For me, Night Shift is not easily, but it's definitely one of his best short story collections. It's very consistently good. Whereas this one, you get a lot of really good ones like Survivor Type and The Jaunt and The Mist, right? You get a lot of great ones, but then you get a lot of either just bad ones, like you get these little poems or these little like 4-page stories that aren't really great, or you get ones that are just forgettable. But there are some really other good ones in here that people might not have heard of, like Mrs. Todd's Shortcut or Nona. Like there are some really good ones in here, but for me, it's a bit too inconsistent. Whereas Night Shift is more consistently great, this one's just a bit inconsistent for me. But I still recommend it, obviously, and there's still time to, shameless plug, join the book club and catch up and read some of the short stories. And then, of course, when we finish this one, we'll be reading Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which you should look out for on my 90s episode of Ranking Stephen King Decades, because he wrote that in 1990, or published it in 1993. But of course, that's kind of irrelevant to Skeleton Crew. Skeleton Crew, inconsistent. That's why it's fairly low on the list at number 14. And this is the part of the video where a lot of people are going to be very mad at me, because the next 3 books I have to talk about would probably easily be in a lot of people's top 5 King books for the 80s. Not even for the 80s, just a lot of people would put at least 2 of these in their top 5 or top 10 Stephen King books overall. But for me, I feel that they're slightly overrated, and I feel that King has better books and more to offer with some of his lesser known works. But I mean, these are definitely great books. I'm not going to say that they're bad, but I am going to say that they're overrated, and I like a lot of more Stephen King books than these books. With all of that being said, number 13, let's just rip off the Band-Aid, Pet Sematary. I know a lot of people love this book. I think it's great, but at the same time, I think it's overrated. It's never been, even when I first read it, it's never been one of my like all-time favorite King books. I would never put this in my top 10. I would probably hesitate it to put in my top 20 or even maybe top 30. Like King just had, you gotta recognize that King has so many great books. And when a lot of people make like Stephen King top 10 lists, they do it even though they've only read like his most popular books, right? But I've read everything pretty much. And of course, like I said, I really like this novel. I really enjoy Michael C. Hall's narration of the book. That even kind of raises it up even more than the book. I just love listening to Dexter read me stuff, right? But again, like it's a good book. It's just never been one of my favorites. And of course, you can leave down in the comments how much of a dumbass I am for not loving this book, but it's pretty good. Never one of my favorites. So for me, I'm going to go with number 13, Pet Sematary. that didn't piss off people, this book surely will. So again, let's just rip off the Band-Aid. Number 12, we're going to go with It. And of course, just because it's this low at number 12 does not mean that I hate this book. It does not mean that I think it's a bad book. I just think it is overrated. Great characters and some of the best character work that King has ever done. But for me, like I said with Pet Sematary, there are more Stephen King books that I enjoy more than this one. And of course, a common complaint with me is pacing. This book does not need to be this long. It's 1,100 pages. I think it could have easily been more like an 800-page book. He could have reduced the word count a bit. There are some scenes that, even though they feel necessary to the plot and the story and the characters, they just go on and on and on. And even though I do enjoy reading it, I've read it twice, so I don't hate this book, y'all. I've read it twice. It's more of a 4-star read for me than like the 5-star perfect status that a lot of people give it. So yeah, don't hate me too much because I really do enjoy it, just not to the extreme level that most constant readers do. So yeah, please don't hate me. I've got It at number 12. And for number 11, I don't know if y'all will be more upset about It and Pet Sematary being this low or this book being this high. I don't know. Leave it down in the comments for me to figure that out. But number 11, I'm going to go with Christine. Now, I loved this book. I loved it a lot. I love the movie. And weirdly enough, fun fact, the book and the movie came out in the same year, which I don't even know how that's possible, but fun little factoid about that. But yes, I really like this book, and I love the characters, and I love the pacing. There's not really much about this book that I don't like. I guess probably my main complaint is that it's written in 3 parts, and part 1, you get a character perspective, and they're in first person, and then in the second part, you switch to another character perspective, and they're in third person, I believe. And then for the last part, you switch to first person. So that can be a little jarring when you're first reading it, but it's not that big a deal. It's just like, it's noticeable, and it's just like, why didn't he write either all of this in third person or all of it in first person? I don't know, but either way, it's still one of my favorite King novels, and I'm very interested to see what you guys think of this. Even though it's fairly popular and it's fairly known among King fans, I don't hear a lot of people talk about this book. Is it underrated? Is it overrated? I really don't know, but I really like it, and for me, it's number 11. And for the last book for this video, for number 10, I'm very curious to see what people think about this, because I've heard some people say it's their favorite in the series, and then I've heard some people say it's their least favorite in the series, and then I've heard people like with middling opinions, like, oh, it's pretty good, it's like somewhere in the middle. So I'm curious. But for me, number 10 for the 1980s, and like I said, the last book for this episode, is The Gunslinger, which is the very first Dark Tower book. And for me, the first time I read this, I was confused. And I liked it, but at the same time, I didn't love it. My real love for the series came with the second book, and then the third book, and then so forth. First time I read it, I think I gave it 3 stars. And then when I reread it, I think I've reread this book twice now, I've given it about like 4.5, 5 stars. It's really good, especially upon a reread. So yes, I really like this book. But believe it or not, there are 9 more Stephen King books that he wrote. I can talk. There's 9 more Stephen King books that he wrote in the 1980s that I love even more than these books. And like I said, these are all, well, not all. A lot of these are good books that I really enjoy reading. So even though these might be your favorites, just keep in mind, these are all my opinions. They're all subjective. They don't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things. This is just a fun video for me to rank all of these. And really, this is just kind of like me preparing for ranking all of his books, like thinking about how I would compare all of these books to each other is very helpful and very insightful for me to like go back and redo my ranking. And I think that will be very fun to do. And let me know if y'all are excited for that after I finish all of... You know what? I'm not even going to show the Talisman. You stay in the corner. You know what you did. Anyway, please let me know what you guys think of my ratings, whether you agree with them or whether you heavily disagree and you think I'm an idiot. Please leave all of those fun comments down in the comment sections below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Bookastromer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me financially, go check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and stay tuned next week for when I rank the rest of the 1980s catalog from Stephen King. There will be some unpopular opinions there, I'm sure, but I'm sure that it'll be fun nonetheless. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching and have a terrific day.